I always thought my parents had my back. Not in some fairy tale, perfect family kind of way, but in the normal sense, where you believe that at the end of the day, your own blood wouldn't betray you. For most of my life, that belief held strong. I grew up in what felt like a normal household. My dad owned a small business, my mom handled all the family finances, and I was always the responsible one. I helped out at the store after school, fixed things around the house when Dad was too busy, and never caused any problems. My younger sister, Emma, was different. She was the quiet, artistic type, the one who needed extra attention. My parents always reassured me that hard work and loyalty would pay off, that I was the kind of son who would make them proud, that one day everything they built would be for the both of us. But looking back now, I realize I was blind to all the warning signs, the things I brushed off, the moments where I should have questioned them. Because the truth, it had been in front of me all along.
The first real red flag came when I overheard my mom on the phone with my uncle. I had just walked past the living room when I heard her say something that made me stop dead in my tracks. "Ethan doesn't need anything. He'll be fine on his own." Her voice was casual, almost dismissive, like it was a simple fact. I stood there for a second, processing it, and then I heard her laugh. "Emma's the one who needs security. A girl needs stability, you know? But Ethan, he'll figure it out."
I remember standing there, trying to convince myself that I was just misunderstanding her words. Maybe she was just talking about how independent I was. Maybe she didn't mean it in the way it sounded. But something about the way she said it, so certain, so final, made me uneasy. A year later, Dad had a minor heart attack. It wasn't serious, but it shook them up enough that suddenly they were talking about wills and inheritance. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured they were just being responsible, planning for the future. But the way they spoke about it, the way conversations would suddenly go silent whenever I entered the room, made me suspicious. I'd catch my mum giving my dad these pointed looks before he quickly changed the subject. Every time I asked if everything was okay, they would brush it off, telling me not to worry about adult things. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed harder. But I didn't. I let it slide, convincing myself that they'd never do anything to hurt me. And then one day, I found the legal documents. I wasn't even looking for them. I was in my dad's office, searching for some tax papers, when my fingers brushed against a thick envelope in the bottom drawer of his desk. It had both of my parents' names on it. I hesitated for a second before I pulled it out, something in my gut telling me that whatever was inside, I wasn't going to like it. I opened it, skimming the first few lines, and that's when my stomach dropped. It was their will. Everything was left to Emma. The house, the savings, the business, even Dad's old watch, the one he used to say he'd pass down to me someday, was listed under Emma's name. And me? I wasn't even mentioned. Not a single word, not a single cent. I stood there, gripping the papers, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. How? Why? Had I done something wrong? Had I disappointed them in some way? Was I nothing to them? It was like they had decided behind closed doors, in a conversation I was never invited to, that I didn't matter, that I didn't belong in their future, that I was disposable, and they thought I'd never find out. They thought they could just erase me, but they were wrong. Because if they wanted to cut me out of their future, I was about to make sure they regretted it.
Backstory. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that will, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. My name wasn't anywhere, not in the list of beneficiaries, not even in a footnote. It was as if I had never existed.
I kept reading, hoping I had missed something, that maybe there was some small mention of me, some explanation, some line that said, Ethan will receive X amount. But there was nothing.
Everything went to Emma.
The house, the savings, the business, and it wasn't just about the money. It was about what it meant. They had deliberately chosen to cut me out.
I slammed the folder shut, my breath uneven. My own parents had looked at me, their firstborn, the son who had helped my dad build that damn business from the ground up, who had sacrificed his weekends working in the shop, who had fixed things around the house when Dad was too busy, who had been the good kid, and they had decided I didn't matter.
At first, I told myself there had to be some mistake. Maybe the will was outdated. Maybe there was another version, somewhere that included me. But deep down, I knew better. The way my parents always treated Emma, the way my mum said Ethan doesn't need anything, the way they suddenly got quiet whenever I walked into a room. It all made sense now. I had just never wanted to see it. That night, I sat in my room, staring at my ceiling, replaying everything in my head. My mind kept going back to all the times I had been the one to step up for this family. I remembered the nights when Dad would come home exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open after long hours at the shop. I would take over, staying late to stock shelves, running errands, making sure everything was set for the next day. I never complained. I never asked for anything in return. I remembered the summer when Mum got sick and had to stay in bed for weeks. I took care of things. I cooked, I cleaned, I helped Emma with her schoolwork, while Dad barely lifted a finger. I did all of that because I thought that's what family does. You help each other without expecting anything back. But apparently that wasn't how it worked in my family. Apparently I was just temporary to them, a placeholder. Someone to rely on when things got tough, but not someone they actually saw as part of their future. And Emma? She didn't even need all of this. She wasn't struggling. She had a good life. She was already talking about moving across the country to study art and live in some loft apartment in the city. But still, my parents wanted to make sure she had everything, and I got nothing. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to let this go. I walked into the kitchen where my mum was sitting, drinking coffee like nothing had happened, scrolling through her phone. My dad was at the table, reading the newspaper, looking as calm as ever. I dropped the will onto the table in front of them. "What is this?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Mum barely even glanced at it. "It's our will," she said casually. "Yeah, I figured that out," I said, trying to keep my anger in check. "What I don't understand is why I'm not in it." That got her attention. She finally looked up at me, setting her coffee down. My dad cleared his throat, but said nothing. "Ethan, we've talked about this before," Mom said, like it was some conversation we had months ago that I had simply forgotten. "You're a smart, capable young man. You don't need handouts. Emma, she needs stability." Handouts. She actually used that word. I laughed, an actual bitter laugh, because it was so ridiculous, so absurd that they truly believed what they were saying. "So let me get this straight," I said, folding my arms. I spent years helping Dad at the shop, fixing things around the house, making sure everything was taken care of when you needed me. And now, when it comes to actually splitting the family's assets, you've just decided I'm good enough to be cut out? My dad finally looked up from his newspaper. He sighed like this conversation was exhausting him already. "Ethan, son, you'll be fine. You're independent. You don't need to rely on us." "That's not the point, Dad," I snapped. "The point is, you didn't even tell me. You made this decision behind my back and you weren't even going to mention it." "We didn't think it was necessary," Mom said, shaking her head. "You're going to do great things on your own, Ethan. You don't need money to be successful." I clenched my jaw. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was about the principle. They had made this choice without me. They had planned my future for me, and they had decided I was worth nothing. And now they were trying to gaslight me into thinking it was a compliment. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, looking at them, at the two people who were supposed to be my family, and realized I didn't know them at all. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. If they thought I was just going to accept this, they were dead wrong, because they may have cut me out of their will. But I was about to cut them out of my life, and they were going to regret it. I didn't talk to my parents much after that conversation. I wasn't interested in hearing more excuses, more half-hearted justifications about why I wasn't entitled to anything. I wasn't looking for an apology either, because I knew I wasn't going to get one. Instead, I started planning. See, my parents thought they had me figured out. They thought I'd just swallow this betrayal, move on like the obedient son they always expected me to be. They figured I'd be too proud to ask for anything, too self-sufficient to fight back. They were wrong. The first thing I did was start looking into the legal side of things. My parents were smart, but they weren't careful. They had been so sure of themselves that they didn't even try to hide the will. That meant there was a good chance they had overlooked other things too, and I was right. A couple of days later, I dug deeper into the business records for my dad's store. Since I had worked there for years, I knew how to access the accounts, the financial statements, even some of the contracts my dad had signed over the years. What I found? Let's just say it changed everything. Turns out my dad wasn't exactly the responsible businessman he pretended to be. His store had been bleeding money for years. There were outstanding loans that hadn't been paid, suppliers who were still waiting for their invoices to be cleared. And worst of all, there was a lien on the store. A lien. Meaning, if he didn't pay off his debt soon, the business, the very same business they had cut me out of, wouldn't even be theirs to give to Emma. My parents had built this whole fantasy about how Emma was the one who needed stability, how she was going to inherit a secure future. But the reality?
The business was already one step away from collapse, and they had no idea I knew. I sat on this information for a while, figuring out my next move. I could have confronted them right away, throw it in their faces, but that would have been too easy. No, I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be blindsided. So instead, I decided to let them dig their own graves. A few weeks later, my parents threw a big family dinner. It was one of those rare occasions where everyone showed up. Uncles, aunts, cousins, family friends. The kind of event where my parents could play their favorite role, the perfect family. I went, of course. Sat through the whole night, listening to them talk about their plans for the future, about how Emma was going to take over the business once she was older. It was honestly laughable. They were standing there, acting like they were passing down some great empire, like they were setting her up for success, completely unaware that their legacy was about to crumble beneath them. And that's when I dropped the first bombshell.
"Hey, Dad," I said casually, taking a sip of my drink. "How's the store doing these days?" He looked up, caught off guard by the question. "Oh, it's doing great," he said, smiling. "Better than ever." I nodded. "That's funny," I said, tilting my head, "because last time I checked, you still owe about $50,000 to suppliers, and there's a lien on the store. You know, the kind that means if you don't pay up soon, you won't even own it anymore." The room went dead silent. My dad's face paled. My mum stiffened. Emma looked confused, blinking between us like she had missed something. "What are you talking about?" my mum said quickly, forcing a laugh. "There's no lien." "Really?" I said, pulling out my phone. "Because I pulled the records myself." I placed my phone on the table, turning the screen toward them. The official document confirming the lien was right there for everyone to see. And just like that, the illusion shattered. My mum was the first to recover. "This is none of your business," she snapped, reaching for the phone. I pulled it away before she could grab it. "Oh, but it is," I said, smiling. "Because this is the business you left to Emma, right? The one you completely cut me out of." My dad opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He knew there was nothing he could say to fix this, because I had just exposed them in front of everyone. That should have been enough. But I wasn't done yet. Because while the business was failing, I had already taken steps to secure my own future, in a way that would make sure my parents never saw me as the less fortunate one again. You see, while they had been so focused on screwing me over, they had completely ignored the fact that I had connections too. Remember those suppliers my dad owed money to? I had already talked to a few of them, and guess what? They were more than happy to start working with someone new. I had spent months building something of my own, a competing business, one that offered better deals, better terms, and better service. And now, I was taking my dad's customers, one by one. My dad didn't find out right away, but within a month, the cracks started showing. Orders dropped, revenue plummeted, suppliers started cutting ties. And then finally came the final blow. I made him an offer to buy out his store at a price so low it was practically an insult. My mum begged him to refuse, said they could fix it. But my dad? He knew the truth. He knew he was out of options. So he signed the papers. And just like that, the business they had refused to give me was mine. I didn't do it for the money, I did it for the lesson. They had tried to erase me from their future. But in the end, I had taken away theirs. And the best part, they had no one to blame but themselves. After my dad signed the papers, it was official. The business that I had worked in since I was a teenager, the one they refused to let me inherit, was now mine. And I had paid pennies for it. But the best part, I wasn't keeping it. I had zero interest in running my father's store. I had only bought it to prove a point, to make sure they knew that the very thing they tried to take away from me was something I didn't even need. So 2 weeks later, I sold it. And not just to anyone. I sold it to a major competitor, a company that had been looking to expand into our area for years. They had deeper pockets, a better business model, and unlike my father, they actually knew how to run a profitable operation. Within days of taking over, they started making big changes, new branding, better pricing. They brought in a completely new team, which meant my parents were officially out of jobs. The day my dad came to the store expecting to walk into his old office was the day he learned just how much he had lost. I was standing there, watching as he walked in, only to be stopped at the front door by security. He looked confused at first, like he couldn't process what was happening. He tried to step inside, but the guard put a hand on his chest. "I need you to step back, sir," the guard said firmly. "What? This is my store," my dad snapped. But it wasn't. Not anymore. One of the new managers walked over, holding a clipboard. He looked at my dad, then at a sheet of paper, then back at my dad. "Mr. Dawson, correct?" "Yeah, what the hell is going on?" The manager didn't even flinch. "We have a no trespassing order against you. You're not allowed on the premises." My dad froze. His face went pale. "What? No, that has to be a mistake. "Sir, if you don't leave, we'll have to call the authorities." And just like that, he was shut out of the business he had spent his entire life trying to hold on to. My mum didn't take it any better. She called me that night, furious. "Ethan, what did you do?" she screamed through the phone. I held the phone away from my ear, letting her rant. She called me every name in the book, accused me of ruining their lives, of being a traitor, of being ungrateful after everything they had done for me. And that's when I laughed. "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated. "You mean like writing me out of your will? Like pretending I didn't exist?" "We were trying to take care of Emma," she shouted. "And what about me?" I snapped. "You didn't even have the decency to tell me. You made that decision behind my back and expected me to just accept it." So yeah, I made a decision too, and now you can live with it. I hung up before she could say another word, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. A few weeks later, I heard through some mutual contacts that my parents had burned through their savings fast. With no business, no steady income, and no backup plan, they were struggling to stay afloat. My dad tried to find work elsewhere, but his reputation was ruined. Everyone in the industry knew that he had run his business into the ground, that he had lost everything. No one wanted to hire him. Emma, on the other hand? She had no idea what to do. She had spent her whole life assuming that everything would be handed to her, that she would inherit a fully functional business and a financially stable future. Instead, she was left with nothing. Then one day, I got an email from my dad. It was short, almost desperate. "Ethan, we need to talk. Please, let's fix this." "Dad," I stared at it for a while, debating whether to respond. Then I closed my laptop. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. The final lesson? I moved on. With the money I made from selling the store, I started my own business, something I actually cared about. Something that wasn't tied to my parents or their mess. It thrived. I built something that was mine, something that no one could take away from me. And my parents? They moved away a few months later. Some cheap apartment in another city. I don't know what they do now. I don't ask. As for Emma, she finally got a job. Nothing fancy, just something to keep herself afloat. We haven't spoken in over a year. And you know what? I'm okay with that. They tried to erase me. Instead, I erased them. And I have no regrets.